Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 5, using the PlayStation 4's version of World of Warships Legends for yet another premium review. Like all my reviews, I want to start out with some history, we'll move into analysis, then we'll discuss commanders, run down the stats with you, and finish off with some gameplay. If you do want to skip around at all, you should see some time codes down in the description. In June 1909, the Empire of Russia laid down the lead ship of a new class of battleship. This would be His Imperial Majesty's ship Gangut. She would be the lead ship in a class that would ultimately comprise of 4 dreadnoughts. As laid down together, Gangut would ultimately be the last of the ships launched in October 1911 and commissioned into service in January 1915. Part of the issue here is that she collided with her sister ship, Poltava, probably a different ship than you're thinking about, while on trials. After commissioning into service, though, she was rather immediately placed into service in the Baltic Fleet. Her first duties were shore bombardment in support of mine layers near Helsinki. Though not particularly illustrious, this action would actually represent the furthest push the Baltic Fleet would have into the Baltic Sea during World War I. On the way back, they ran aground and suffered a minor mutiny, but that was pretty much it in terms of her service to Russia. In 1917, her crew joined the general mutiny of the February Revolt in St. Petersburg, and other than operating as a troop transport ahead of Lenin's capitulation to Germany in April, she saw no further service here. Following this, though, the ship was somewhat forced into reserve because its crew basically walked off the job. The Bolsheviks would rename the ship after the October Revolution. This was, of course, the Bolshevik coup, which occurred on either October 25th, according to the Julian calendar, which was used by Imperial Russia, or curiously enough, November 7th, 1918, which is based on the Gregorian calendar that pretty much all of us use today, including the Bolsheviks themselves. In any case, the October Revolution would mark the beginning of the Red Terror, a series of political executions that killed a lot of people, ignited a civil war that would see another 10 million casualties, and exiled millions more Russians from their country, one of which was a commander that we have in game, Mikhail Kedrov. Really, pretty much the only good thing that came out of this period in Russian history was the inspiration for a name of an infinitely more pronounceable fictional submarine that would serve as the titular setting for a really fun nautical movie starring Alec Baldwin and Sean Connery. But they did rename the Gangut after the revolution. In any case, it should be no surprise that the various factions fighting in a land war in Russia had no particular use for a dreadnought, so the ship was inactive for about 8 years. When reactivated, she was put up for modernization that would last until 1934. When she next saw service, it was during the Winter War, wherein Russia invaded Finland in an attempt to gain a little bit more of a buffer should their friend/potential enemy at the time, Germany, decide to invade. As I mentioned in my Leningrad review, this was a good time to be on a boat because God only knows how many people the Soviets sent to their deaths for just a few territorial concessions. In any case, the Gangut's participation was only a bit of shore bombardment before retiring for the coldest parts of the winter, where the Baltic Sea would be effectively frozen solid and unnavigable. Though ostensibly the Winter War was supposed to give the Soviets a buffer against any German invasion, they were nevertheless surprised when Operation Barbarossa got underway in June of 1941. At that point, the ship was in Tallinn and had to fight a retreat back to Kronstadt. Along the way, she took several bombs which disabled half of her turrets, but she was able to make it back to port for repairs. The rest of her service during World War II can be summed up pretty quickly as artillery support for forces defending mostly Leningrad, but also for advancing Red Army troops once the siege there had been lifted. This maybe isn't the most interesting of all histories, but considering that most of the rest of the Baltic Sea was swarming with German ships, most of the air over it was swarming with German planes, and to go anywhere else meant driving past Germany itself, it's understandable. Besides, the Luftwaffe did mount plenty of attacks against her, even when she was in Soviet waters. Though a bit long in the tooth at the time, she was a formidable artillery platform, so the Germans had good reason to want to get rid of her. She was bombed twice in port, and she was struck at least on 3 separate occasions while defending Leningrad, sometimes by multiple bombs. For the most part, damage to the ship was limited to disabling anti-aircraft mounts, though in one occasion, one of her turrets was taken out by dive bombers. Each time she went into dock, she'd tend to pick up a few more AA guns, which probably helped her with her claims of shooting down around 20 aircraft over the course of the war. She was credited with firing the last battleship shells fired by a Soviet battleship during the war, though this was in June of 1944, about 11 months before VE Day and 15 months before the end of the Soviet involvement in the war. Due to the relatively few ships the Red Fleet had following World War II, or the Great Patriotic War as it is more commonly known in Russia, she would stay a part of the Soviet fleet as a training ship starting in 1954, before being stricken from the ranks in 1956 and slowly broken up for scrap. As far as the ship in-game, the Gungut already exists at Tier 3, and the upgraded hull here basically helps you, to a certain extent, fend off air attacks. There are some minor differences in terms of her overall profile, and her armor, which mostly doesn't help you out, but the upgrades as depicted in the game don't greatly change the way that you play this ship. In terms of overall strengths and weaknesses, I don't really disagree what's put on the screen, and really it's not that different from playing the Tier 3 version of this same ship. So based on what Wargaming is telling you, you have a lot of guns. Which is kind of true. You do have 2 more guns than average. It's not necessarily a huge advantage, but it is true. They are a bit smaller than normal, which is also true, though I'm not sure that I would really classify this as a disadvantage, given that you're going to be shooting at a lot of things that don't have a lot of armor. And this is actually somewhat advantageous when you're shooting at cruisers. Your shells are a little bit less likely to overpenetrate. It's just going to be a bit harder to land a really devastating salvo against other battleships. But in my experience, it's still very doable. As far as the ballistics go, they are moderately faster shells than normal, and this good ballistic stuff just means that the ship doesn't lob shells very high, which isn't always a bad thing, nor are low flying shells always a good thing. Just ask anyone who's ever played a game on a map that features an island. The only other thing I would add is that the survivability on this ship is pretty underwhelming, both because the typical consumable limitations that you get on Soviet ships, and also the near-typical Russian armor values, poor torpedo protection, and the plain old simple fact that you just don't have that many hit points. For those thinking about this or the Imperator Nikolai, the short story is that the Imperator is a better ship as long as there isn't an aircraft carrier in the game, at which point you would almost certainly prefer to have this ship. When looking at your standard 3 commanders, I'll start with von Essen, because this might be surprising, but I actually used him for a lot of my low-level Russian battleships. This is, in part, because it's easy to get access to a 3rd heal and additional damage control from fully packed. You get an easy 5 damage control consumables with collective labor, so he really requires very little investment to make the ship noticeably more comfortable for most people to play. In this case, I'd probably also use him to pick up some extra AA, because right now, that's probably the best choice for this ship, and maybe the best pick that he has available among skills in slot 1. After that, it's a question of whether you want more range, maneuverability, concealment, or better turret traverse, and they're all completely reasonable decisions. With Gawler, you probably know exactly what you want to get out of this. You want to hit more often, and you want to hit a little bit harder. To some extent, this works, but I did still find that after 9 or 10 kilometers, the dispersion is pretty screwy. Again, it's probably better, but I still found it to be frustrating. Unfortunately, your downsides here are that you have very little going for you in terms of improving your survivability, and anything that makes your guns better also makes this ship feel pretty ponderously slow. The commander I will probably use to run on this ship, though, is Kedrov, and that is basically because he more than doubles your healing potential, and I get shot a lot. And for folks that are comfortable with having one fire on their ship, Firefighter is pretty much invaluable. The only real questions here are probably going to be what to choose in your first slot, with all 3 choices here being reasonable, but with Brawler being the most controversial. But I rather like the choice since I have been given no reason to believe that I'm going to hit anything beyond 10 kilometers with any sort of consistency anyway. As we enter stats, remember the stats you see on screen are stock, but with the tier 4 camo that comes with it already applied. For survivability, you might be forgiven if this looks pretty unimpressive. 42,500 hit points is the second lowest of any tier 4 battleship, and it is worth mentioning that this is even more of a problem if you're going out there with just 2 heals. The 12 to 305mm of armor doesn't look very good either, but this is a little deceptive. As we look into the armor, there's a lot of orange here, so she's actually fairly well resistant to both HE and AP for the tier. If you do want to shoot HE at this, you probably want to aim for this lightly armored forecastle or forecastle. This was probably an improvement for the crew, but it does actually add a weak spot that isn't found on the original Gangut, so it's not going to do you any favors. Similarly, the aft extension over the rear quarterdeck or her superstructure also is very easy to penetrate. As long as you maintain a decent angle, there's nothing that you can face that will overmatch you at the waterline, and even if the belt armor is a bit weak, you do actually have a turtleback, which I was actually really surprised to learn for reasons that you can probably guess. If you're trying to defeat the turtleback on this ship at close and medium range, try to land your shots between the first and second turret. The angle of the plate here seems to be too steep to provide much protection at those ranges, but it is an auto bounce towards the back of the ship, and the citadel itself is quite a bit thicker towards the front. Torpedo protection is just 10%, which is the worst at the tier, about half of average, but it's really only 1 to 3% worse than what you'd be expecting on other Soviet battleships at tier 4. Coming to artillery, you have 4 turrets, each mounting 3 12-inch guns, though they come in a fairly unconventional arrangement, evenly spaced along the length of the ship. In truth, this isn't a practical difference in terms of firepower when you're firing at an angle, and as long as you aren't trying to shoot directly forward. In that case, the superstructure is going to get in your way, and you will be limited to just 1 turret. Since one of your weaknesses is right on the nose of the ship, you will want to always drive around at an angle to invite a few more shots into the belt of your ship, and the firing angles on these guns are generally pretty good. The other thing worth mentioning here is that your guns are relatively small for the tier, with the majority of battleships you will be facing having something in the area of 14 inches. In theory, this would cause a few more bounces if you're shooting at things with 22 to 24 millimeters of armor, but there actually aren't a lot of surfaces in that range at this tier. So the trade-off tends to be a little less obvious. You have guns that individually do about 250 less HE damage and about 1,000 less AP damage than most battleships, and they actually reload 2 seconds slower than the normal 30 seconds you'll find on a battleship. But this is a 4-second improvement over the tech tree Gangut, but you do have 2 more guns than average. All in all, this means you are a pretty good fire starter among battleships at the tier. You have above average AP DPM and above average HE DPM as well. The only other thing worth talking about on this screen is the 56-second turret traverse is very average among battleships at tier 4, but this will feel a little bit slower if you compare it to ships like the Nikolai, which has a better turret arrangement in general, or the Pyotr Veliki, which is just kind of an absurd battleship all the way around. AA is interesting because you actually score pretty well for having such a pathetic AA range. There's actually only one ship that has a shorter AA range, which is the Nikolai. And actually, if you were to compare this ship to the Nikolai, this is where the Emperor really has no clothes. The rating here seems to be entirely due to DPM and flak. Planes that do hang out overhead will take plenty of significant losses, but with crafty torpedo bombers who launch further out, they can do so without really risking too many of their planes. Improving the range here with your slot 1 equipment choice is an idea worth considering, in part because this will bump your AA range beyond aerial drop torpedoes, and in part because aiming with this particular ship seems to be an effort with questionable value. When we come to maneuverability, you're not slower than average, and if you choose Gauler, you'll be in the American standard class battleship range of speed and maneuverability. Unsurprisingly, for a slow battleship, you do have a slightly better than average turning circle, and your rudder shift is almost half a second better than average. Overall, the maneuverability here is just acceptable. For concealment, you're not exactly stealthy, you are a battleship, but 13.2 is pretty good, 300 meters less than average, and the advantage here gets shaved down a little bit to 100 meters from the air, such that it will matter. 10.1 kilometers is almost a full kilometer less detectable while firing from smoke. For consumables, you get what you get. There are no choices here, at least at the moment. And the only way that you can mess with any of this stuff is through your commander choices. First, you get a Soviet damage control consumable, which is truly consumable, because you only start with 3 of them, rather than an unlimited number of uses. The advantage is you have a 40-second cooldown rather than 80 seconds, and a 10-second duration, which isn't bad. Unfortunately, the disadvantage is if you run out of them, then whatever happens to your ship is just whatever happens to your ship. You have a fairly standard repair party, but like other Soviet battleships, you only start with 2 heals. This is nothing surprising, but considering your low hit points, it may play into your commander decision. But last, and definitely least, you do have an enhanced secondary consumable. This is going to be a panic button for you more than anything else. You actually don't really have good secondaries on this ship at all, and to get all of them on one side working, you're going to have to drive really broadside, and then you're going to die. So this is here. Press this button if somebody gets close enough to you that they can actually start shooting, but expect it to work about as well as the Soviet economy. And finally, we're going to get to the gameplay. Obviously, we're going to be on Ring. Those of you with keen senses will notice that this is a 6 versus 6 rather than the average 9 versus 9. Maybe some of you will wonder why that is. If you're viewing this in the future, this is what will probably be known as the dark times. There are just too many people trying to play tier 3 carriers right now, which means you never get a full match. So hopefully that'll fix itself, but as a fan of history, I guess the Dark Ages lasted for ages. So anyway, we'll go ahead and put our commander up on the screen. This is not a particularly purpose-built sort of commander build. This is just my comfort zone sort of everyday sort of commander thing. So we've got things going on in the background, obviously, and that's not at all helped by anything that I've taken here in terms of accuracy. And already you can hear the first planes flying overhead as this game just gets going a lot faster than I want to talk about it. But basically, the build there that you see, if I were to change something, switching out Brawler for extra AA makes a lot of sense on this particular boat. Switching out the aiming modification actually also makes sense for AA. This ship does have a decent AA. The only problem is that its range is horrible. But if people fly over you, obviously you can shoot down their planes. So obviously we're moving forward into A. We already have done a terrible thing to a player on the enemy team. That is just a thing that will happen to cruisers because pretty much none of them have any armor, most especially Royal Navy. Now you can definitely see that this aircraft carrier really wants a piece of me, which is fine. As you can see, he's losing some more planes for his dedication to trying to murder me. If he was using dive bombers, one thing about this ship is it does seem to take a lot of damage from HE bombs. That's probably because of its superstructure that's not too difficult to actually hit. And Also, that forecastle, the raised deck on the front, is a really, really weak target. So is the extension over the rear quarterdeck there. And I'm pretty sure it can just punch your deck anyway. So maybe none of that stuff matters anyway. I'm a little bit amused that this guy is smoking me. I go ahead and slow down a little bit here to just make the aircraft carrier fly over top me without being able to see me. Unfortunately, this does get my teammate killed behind me, so not so good. But we are getting some more AA in on those airplanes, and we're up to 10 kills, or at least in terms of AA kills. Just one boat. Pyotr Veliki is probably a little too far away for me to reliably hit him. And your guns at this range, since they are just 12 inches, probably don't have enough oomph on them to really get the big hits against a heavy target at this range. But obviously you can see we still managed to land about half of our shots. Not particularly well, but we do land them. The front of the Texas is really not all that well armored, so we decide to shoot the front of that instead of the front of the Pyotr Veliki, which has just like an 80mm bow, and I think its upper belt is also pretty good. So frontally, the best thing to do if I wanted to fight a Pyotr Veliki is just load the HE. He's actually kind of sailing off there. Due to the turret rotation, I'm just trying to keep all of my guns on one side for the entire game. And as you can see, one of the reasons why that aircraft carrier might be a little concerned about me is I'm now in range of him. And thanks to the 6 versus 6 nature of the combat, we actually have already scored a high caliber with just 78,000 damage. So this is not exactly amazing sort of gameplay. It's exactly what you expect with Russian battleships. They're pretty good at pushing one side. In this case, we just kind of ran everybody over. And we haven't actually gotten all that much attention from anybody other than the aircraft carrier. If we had, you'd see pretty easily that front forecastle is going to get punched every time if they do hit it. The rest of this ship is reasonably bouncy. Obviously, superstructure still takes damage like everybody else. But other than that, this is Russian gameplay. What do you want? So, closing thoughts. This ship is pretty okay. It comes with pretty standard Soviet baggage, so if you're okay with the heal situation, the damage control situation, and the dispersion that you tend to get in Soviet battleships, then this ship may not be bad for you. Honestly, you can almost test drive the ship since the Gangut is the Tier 3 Russian tech tree battleship, and other than having a lot more superstructure to shoot, and of course that fat forecastle that I keep talking about, and not getting dunked on quite as bad in this ship as you will in the Gangut by aircraft carriers, this ship is basically the same idea. So yeah, get some games under your belt with that, and you probably don't really need my opinion at all that way. Probably could have just led with that, but thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this little review, and I'll see you on the next one.